Number 9. KILDIN. KILDIN is a small Russian island located in the Barents Sea, roughly 75 miles off the Norwegian coast. It's filled with old, rotting military equipment, including planes and construction vehicles, as well as a deposit of expended reactors from Soviet nuclear submarines. The Russian presence on the island goes back to 1957, when an underground missile complex was built there. It was designed to aim at enemy vessels that came too close to KILDIN for comfort. By World War II, the island's facilities had grown to include many underground tunnels, commander facilities, and storage spaces. During the Soviet era, there were 4 vessels that operated between the island and the mainland. Today, there's no human activity on KILDIN. The military left in 1995, just a few years after the Soviet Union collapsed. Just one vessel even goes near the island, and it doesn't stop there. It just passes by while traveling its route between Murmansk and Ostrovnoy. But the decaying military equipment remains there, eerie and abandoned. The waters off KILDIN have seen plenty of activity even after its closure. In 1992, 3 years before the military left, the American submarine USS Baton Rouge collided with the Russian vessel K-276 Kostroma. 11 years later, in 2003, the Russian submarine K-159 sank off KILDIN during a storm while on the way to a scrapyard. 9 members of the 10-person crew tragically perished in the accident. Number 8. CLIPPERTON. CLIPPERTON Island is a tiny, isolated atoll in the eastern Pacific, located just west of Mexico. While no one lives there now, it was inhabited for a short time during the early 20th century. It's hard to understand how this barren landmass, with no freshwater source, appealed to anyone. But it was once abundant with guano, or bat droppings, a highly profitable raw material used in fertilizer. Eager to cash in on the valuable manure, the British Pacific Mining Company built a mining operation on CLIPPERTON with permission from the Mexican government. Around 100 men and women moved there for work. Their necessities came every 2 months by ship. These infrequent but once reliable shipments stopped during the Mexican Revolution. People who lived on CLIPPERTON were simply forgotten about as they languished without food, medication, and other life-sustaining supplies. At one point, a passing American ship offered to help. Confident that Mexico would come to their aid, the island's overseer, Captain Raymond Arnault, stubbornly refused any assistance. By 1915, malnutrition and scurvy had killed most of CLIPPERTON's residents. One day, Arnault and 3 other men tried catching the attention of a distant ship, but their canoe capsized and they drowned. 2 years later, only 1 man and 15 women remained. The sole surviving man went on a rape and murder campaign and declared himself the king of CLIPPERTON, but his reign was short-lived. Arnault's wife and another woman killed him. Hours later, a US Navy vessel rescued the remaining handful of survivors. The settlement's ruins are still on the island, which receives no visitors due to its remoteness. Number 7. Fort CARROL. Located in Maryland's Patapsco River near the Francis Scott Key Bridge, Fort CARROL is the name of both a 3.5-acre man-made island and the abandoned hexagonal fort that sits on it. Built in 1848 to protect the city of Baltimore from naval attacks, it was commissioned by Robert E. Lee, who went on to command the Confederate Army during the American Civil War. Fort CARROL never saw combat, and by World War I, the structure and its weaponry were outdated. The property was disarmed and abandoned in 1921. It was briefly used as a firing range during the Second World War. In 1958, a Baltimore-based lawyer named Benjamin Eisenberg bought the island with plans to build a casino, a hotel, and some restaurants on it. But the judge ruled that the fort is in a county where slots are illegal, and Eisenberg ended up doing absolutely nothing with the property. The Eisenberg family still owned Fort CARROL as of late 2019. It's become decrepit and overgrown and has no purpose other than functioning as a de facto bird sanctuary. The crumbling and cracked concrete structure is home to hundreds of seagulls, herons, and members of other avian species. Urban explorers are typically the only humans to visit the island. The property was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2015 at the urging of the Maryland Historical Trust and with support from the Eisenbergs. It was valued at $31,500, and any potential buyers must be willing to restore the fort. Would you be interested in buying your own island, bird sanctuary, and historical fixer-upper at that price? Share in the comments. Number 6. NAVASSA. Most people have never heard of NAVASSA, arguably the strangest Caribbean island. It's barely bigger than Central Park in New York City. It's located between Haiti and Cuba and belongs to the United States. NAVASSA's first known visitors were some crewmen who were sent there by Columbus in 1504. They drank contaminated water and died shortly after arriving. In 1857, an American sea captain claimed the island as a U.S. territory. For the next 30 years, it was mined for its extensive deposits of guano, or bird droppings, which was used for making gunpowder and fertilizer. In 1889, after mining over 1 million tons of guano by hand, the African-American workers at NAVASSA rebelled and killed 5 of their supervisors. Ownership of the island thereafter became a contentious, ongoing debate that eventually went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. NAVASSA was abandoned in 1898 after the Spanish-American War. Today, it's filled mostly with feral dogs, lizards, and the occasional team of researchers. The island's ownership is still being disputed. Haiti claims NAVASSA in its constitution, and the US designated it as a national wildlife refuge in 1999. In 2012, scientists discovered a rich coral ecosystem in the reefs surrounding the island. It consists of numerous endangered coral species. Regardless of which country owns NAVASSA, it's arguably a good thing that people rarely go there, and that its environment is protected from human activity. Number 5. HASHIMA. HASHIMA is a 16-acre island located off the coast of Nagasaki, Japan. It was once home to a coal mining facility and a surrounding settlement that grew rapidly as workers and their families moved in. People, buildings, and pathways were literally stacked on top of each other at HASHIMA. Concrete tower blocks were connected by a series of overhead bridges, as well as a maze of streets and underground tunnels. Shops, schools, public pools, and other buildings sprang up to accommodate HASHIMA's rapidly growing population. The metropolis eventually became so jam-packed that the island had to be expanded with landfill. At its peak, HASHIMA was home to 5,259 residents and had a population density of 216,264 people per square mile, or 2.5 square kilometers. To give you an idea of just how crowded it was, modern-day Manhattan has a population density of 66,940 people per square mile, or 2.5 square kilometers. As many as 6 people were crammed into each tiny apartment. The demand for coal eventually fell and the industry began to lag, leading to HASHIMA's closure in 1974. After nearly a century of use, the island was abandoned. Many families left their belongings behind, and the structures they once occupied and used were also simply left as is. What's left of the once bustling city now sits eerily silent and crumbling from decades of neglect. The ruins at HASHIMA are dangerous. Visitors can catch a glimpse from a distance during guided tours, but exploring the ruins up close requires special permission from local authorities. Would you think it's worthwhile to seek the special permission needed to explore these dense abandoned ruins? Share in the comments and make sure to like and subscribe to the channel as well. Number 4. TROMELIN Island. Located roughly 280 miles east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean, the very small island of TROMELIN is part of the Scattered Islands. Also known as the Îles Éparses, the French-owned archipelago was discovered in 1722. It was mostly left alone until 1761, when the French slave ship L'Utile wrecked at TROMELIN's northern reef. There were initially hundreds of survivors who worked together to dig a well and build a shelter. A white crew left on a boat made from the salvaged remains of L'Utile, promising to return for the 60 surviving slaves they left on the island. But no one returned until 15 years later when the French ship La Dauphine arrived in 1776. Miraculously, 7 of the original survivors, all women, were still alive, along with an 8-month-old infant. They had survived by digging small shelters on the flat island and fortifying them with rocks. The group stayed fed by eating crabs and turtles that came there to nest. Nobody visited TROMELIN Island again until 1856. The French established a weather station there in 1954. Despite the limited number of people there at any given time, the island still suffered from human activity. By the time the weather station was implemented, just 2 of the 8 different bird species that once bred there remained. The island also became overrun by invasive rodents, including mice and Norway rats. The Norway rats were successfully eradicated in 2005. Since then, much of TROMELIN Island's vegetation and wildlife has recovered. Several seabirds have returned, including the brown-footed booby. Today, the island's human presence is restricted to scientific researchers, and its ecosystem continues to thrive. The remains of the castaways' shelters are still there as an eerie reminder of how 60 resilient souls were once left to die, but managed to make do with the few materials that were available to them. Number 3. Ross Island. During the British imperial rule over India in the 19th century, royal colonial authorities established a penal colony in the remote Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the Indian Ocean. Located over 800 miles from the Indian mainland, the far-flung region seemed like the perfect place for imprisoning rebels who fought back against British rule. Officials chose a tiny landmass measuring less than 1/3 of a square mile, known as Ross Island, as the penal colony's administrative headquarters. They forced inmates to clear trees to make rooms for dozens of upscale Victorian-style buildings, including an extravagant bungalow for the penitentiary's commissioner. Ross Island also had tennis courts, swimming pools, a church, and elegant gardens, ensuring that top-ranking prison staff had to make minimal sacrifices when it came to the luxurious lifestyle they were accustomed to. Meanwhile, convicts languished in deplorable conditions. They were malnourished, overworked, exposed to disease, and experimented on with malaria drugs that made them extremely sick and depressed. For decades, human rights abuses were committed against prisoners simply for daring to fight for their country's freedom. The site finally closed in 1937. Just a handful of years later, during World War II, the Japanese raided Ross Island in search of useful materials. Soon enough, the Allies recaptured it. Today, the Indian government oversees the eerie crumbling ruins, which have been reclaimed by nature. Number 2. Año Nuevo Island. Located off the California coast between San Francisco and Santa Cruz, Año Nuevo is a 9-acre island with a lighthouse that helped ships navigate from 1872 to 1948. At first, a foghorn was installed following several shipwrecks near the shoreline. After that, a light, keeper's quarters, dock, boathouse, and other support facilities were built. It was a challenge to maintain the structures due to damage from the salty sea air, and wild seals invaded the buildings despite fences being built to prevent them from getting in. In 1948, the Coast Guard deemed the facilities at Año Nuevo Island too expensive to maintain and ordered its closure. The system that was once operated by a staff was replaced by a marker buoy with automatic sound, light, and radar. In 1955, the federal government sold the island to the state of California. In an effort to protect breeding seal colonies, authorities classified it as a scientific preserve and banned visitors. The buildings on Año Nuevo Island deteriorated from prolonged exposure to the elements and a lack of upkeep. They were also damaged and burned by trespassers. Elephant seals, sea lions, and birds took over the keeper's quarters, furthering the decay. Today, the island remains closed to the public and is overrun by thousands of marine animals. Its only human visitors are researchers. Some of the abandoned structures still stand, but they're in extremely poor shape. Number 1. Discovery Island. In Bay Lake, Florida, there's an 11.5-acre island that was once home to Disney's Discovery Island, where visitors went to see rare birds and other exotic wildlife starting in 1974. The park closed in 1999 after operating for 25 years. While the reasons for shuttering its doors remain somewhat of a mystery, poor attendance and high maintenance costs were likely factors in the decision. Discovery Island's animals were relocated to Disney's Animal Kingdom. The former park has sat abandoned ever since. It mostly draws curious urban explorers like Shane Perez, a blogger who swam through alligator-infested waters with his friends to reach Discovery Island in 2009, more than a decade after it closed. When they first arrived on the island, it sounded as if they were surrounded by thousands of birds, Perez later recalled. They encountered several angry vultures before discovering that the electrics still worked inside the park's haunting remnants, which had become overgrown with plant wildlife. The group also found old Polaroid photos of employees scattered throughout the buildings, as well as preserved snakes inside jars and plenty of garbage, including an empty Coca-Cola bottle. Not all of Discovery Island's unwelcome visitors found it as creepy as Perez and his pals did. When authorities discovered a homeless man camping there in 2020 and ordered him to leave, he described the park as a tropical paradise and said that he didn't know he wasn't allowed to be there. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn about more fascinating abandoned islands, let me know in the comments below. And while you're at it, be sure to subscribe. I'll see you next time.